By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in. There was no barn for her animals or tools. There was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car pop 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. And initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack. He handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you. He turned around and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him. And then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman. That was how he made his living. And so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously this was very suspicious, and right away the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately. And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, okay, and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you. And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, no, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what is being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, ma'am, you're going to have to come with us. Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, has anyone died on your property? The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen, and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyway. anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask. And so he just said, well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone? Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm. And if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators. And she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like, who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delacino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard. But at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security at a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're gonna go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. Before you come back to the control room, you'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. Everything in the building was pretty old. And Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon. He's looking down the hall, he doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes two things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol, he's got it on the door as well, and they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there, and there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights, they shut all the doors, everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been, locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement, and even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet, and there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that that door slammed. But the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke, and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in, and there's no fire, but all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking, and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire, and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was and they sit down and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator, and he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's in the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows. But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's looking out the window and he hears this alarm, this like ringing sound going off, but the door isn't shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door, why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement, and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, there's no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut, one by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? Maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea, and so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him. And so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater and Greg shows up. And so they start this tour, they go in the main auditorium, they're looking around, and they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light, and Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we gotta go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture. And he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And it starts turning its head like this. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder. The piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light. No one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, "You can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, "Hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, "What's going on? Is someone still in there?" He said that he had been doing security rounds, and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was whirring up to the third floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, "Look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together." They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, "What?" And Josh goes, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, "Great, I'm glad I work here now." This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. So I'd love to get your reaction to this. Was this a ghost or was this something else? I will get back to all of the early commenters. So get your comments in there, give me your theories, and I'll get back to all of the early commenters. If you enjoyed this story and you haven't already done this, please place the like button's feet in cement and then throw them into the ocean. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads.